Red Lynnewood Hall was built to do something radical, to make wealth permanent, to turn money into power, culture, and legacy, carved in stone. At its peak, this house was not a home. It was a private empire, a palace designed to outlast generations, economic cycles, and even history itself. And yet, today, it stands empty. In this documentary, we tell the full story of Red Lynnewood Hall, not just how it was built, but why it was built, what it was meant to prove, and how it became the largest abandoned mansion of the Gilded Age. We will examine the man who commissioned it, the world that made such excess possible, and the architectural choices that transformed a residence into a self-contained kingdom. We will trace its rise, its transformation, and its collapse. Room by room, system by system, generation by generation. This is the story of how American wealth tried to make itself immortal. How art, architecture, and scale were used to manufacture legacy, and why even a palace of this magnitude could not survive the collapse of the world that created it. By the end, Red Lynnewood Hall will no longer feel like an abandoned house. It will stand as a warning, a record, and one of the most complete fossils of the American Gilded Age. Now, let's begin. Lynnewood Hall was constructed at the very end of the 19th century, when American industrial wealth had reached a level never seen before. It was commissioned by Peter A.B. Widener, a man who embodied the American Gilded Age in every possible sense. Born into modest circumstances, Widener rose through strategic investments, political connections, and industrial expansion to become one of the wealthiest men in the United States. This estate was not built as a retreat. It was built as a statement. Construction began in 1899 under the direction of architect Horace Trumbauer, one of the most prolific and influential architects of elite America. Trumbauer specialized in monumental private residences, designed to convey power through scale, symmetry, and material. At Lynnewood Hall, he was given near unlimited resources. The mansion cost approximately $8 million to build at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that figure exceeds $250 million today. The result was a structure containing roughly 110 rooms, including 55 bedrooms, 20 bathrooms, 5 dedicated art galleries, multiple ballrooms, conservatories, service corridors, tunnels, vaults, and one of the largest private indoor swimming pools ever constructed in a private residence. In sheer volume, Lynnewood Hall approached 100,000 square feet when including basements and attic spaces. It was nearly twice the size of the White House, but size alone was never the purpose. Lynnewood Hall was designed to function as both a family residence and a museum. Widener was a serious art collector, not merely a social one. His collection included works by Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Bellini, Titian, Raphael, and countless other masters. Entire wings of the house were devoted exclusively to art display, with skylights engineered to control natural illumination throughout the day. The house itself was subdued compared to other Gilded Age palaces. The true spectacle was meant to be the art. The interior organization followed a strict hierarchy. Public rooms were designed for awe. The Great Hall, inspired by the breakers in Newport, greeted visitors with soaring ceilings, imported marble, and elaborate ironwork. From there, guests were ushered into reception rooms, ballrooms, and galleries meant to establish status within moments. Private family spaces were separated into east and west wings. Servants moved through hidden staircases and corridors, rarely seen by the household or guests. The estate employed roughly 40 live-in staff, supported by entire underground service networks. Kitchens, bakeries, cold storage rooms, coal rooms, vaults, and workshops operated beneath the surface, allowing the visible world above to function without interruption. Nothing was accidental. After Peter A. B. Widener's death in 1915, the estate passed to his son, Joseph Widener. Joseph fundamentally transformed Lynnewood Hall. Where his father favored Victorian heaviness, Joseph embraced French design. He stripped away much of the original Victorian ornamentation and reimagined the house as a French country palace. Floors were replaced, ceilings altered, fireplaces relocated, and entire rooms reconfigured. The gardens followed the same evolution. Originally Italianate, they were reshaped into formal French parterres with fountains, terraces, and long axial views extending from the house. The estate once spanned nearly 300 acres, including farms, greenhouses, power plants, and staff housing. Despite its magnificence, Lynnewood Hall's golden age was brief. The Widener family suffered devastating losses, most notably through their connection to the RMS Titanic. George Dunton Widener and his son Harry Elkins. Widener perished in the sinking, while Eleanor Elkins. Widener survived. Harry's death led to one of the family's most enduring philanthropic acts, the donation of his rare book collection to Harvard University and the construction of the Widener Library, which still bears his name today. Joseph Widener continued to live at Lynnewood Hall until his death in 1943. Shortly after, the art collection was donated to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. One of the greatest private art collections ever assembled quietly left the house forever. Without the art, without the family, and without the social world that sustained it, Lynnewood Hall no longer fit into modern America. Large estates like this had become financially unsustainable. Taxes increased, labor costs rose, social customs changed. The house was sold. In 1952, Lynnewood Hall became the campus of a theological seminary. For decades, it was carefully maintained, though adapted for institutional use. Dormitories replaced bedrooms. Classrooms replaced galleries. Kitchens were simplified. Some historic elements were removed and sold to cover expenses during financial hardship. By the late 20th century, the seminary could no longer sustain the property. The estate passed into private hands once more. Since then, Lynnewood Hall has slowly fallen into disrepair. Today, it stands largely abandoned. Its halls echo, ceilings collapse, water infiltrates stone and plaster, iron rusts, paint peels, skylights are sealed shut. Entire rooms sit frozen in partial decay, holding the ghost outlines of a world that once operated at the highest level of wealth humanity had ever seen. Yet even in ruin, Lynnewood Hall remains extraordinary. Its tunnels still run beneath the gardens. Vault doors remain sealed. Marble bathtubs, fireplaces, and swimming pools endure beneath layers of neglect. Hand-carved moldings and ceilings survive where restoration has not yet reached. This is not simply a decaying mansion. It is a complete fossil of the Gilded Age mindset. A belief that wealth could build permanence, that legacy could be carved in stone, that private power could outlast time itself. Lynnewood Hall proves otherwise. Preservation efforts now focus on stabilizing what remains and determining whether restoration is even possible. Such a project would be among the largest private residential restorations in American history. It would require enormous funding, careful research, and long-term stewardship. Whether Lynnewood Hall is ultimately restored, repurposed, or lost entirely, its story remains essential. It reveals how wealth is created, displayed, inherited, and ultimately abandoned. It shows how even the most powerful families cannot outrun time, economics, or changing social structures. Red Lynnewood Hall stands today not as a failure, but as a warning and a record. A monument to ambition, a museum without art, a palace without people, and a silent reminder that even at the height of America's Gilded Age, nothing built by human hands was meant to last forever. Lynnewood Hall rises from the Pennsylvania landscape with a presence that is impossible to ignore. Even in its current state of decay, the structure dominates its surroundings, not just by size, but by intention. This was never meant to be a home that blended in. It was designed to assert permanence, authority, and cultural supremacy at a moment when American wealth believed itself unstoppable. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States was experiencing an unprecedented concentration of capital. Railroads, steel, oil, finance, and urban infrastructure had created a new class of industrial elites whose fortunes rivaled and, in many cases, exceeded those of Europe's old aristocracies. Unlike inherited nobility, this wealth was new, aggressive, and deeply invested in public display. Mansions were not merely residences. They were instruments of legitimacy. Lynnewood Hall was one of the most extreme expressions of this belief. Construction began in 1899, commissioned by Peter Arrell Brown Widener, one of the most powerful financiers of his era. Widener's rise followed the classic Gilded Age trajectory. Born to modest means in Philadelphia, he leveraged wartime supply contracts during the Civil War, then reinvested his profits into streetcar systems, rail infrastructure, steel, shipping, and banking. By the end of the 19th century, Widener was embedded in nearly every major industrial artery of the American economy. But wealth alone was not enough. Social power in this era required architecture. For this task, Widener selected Horace Trumbauer, an architect whose career was defined by scale, symmetry, and disciplined grandeur. Trumbauer understood that elite American clients wanted more than beauty. They wanted authority translated into stone. His designs drew heavily from European classical traditions, particularly French and Italian models, but they were executed with American ambition and industrial resources. Lynnewood Hall was conceived not as a country house, but as a palace. The site itself was chosen with strategic intent. Located outside Philadelphia, the estate occupied elevated ground, allowing the mansion to command long axial views across its gardens and grounds. Originally spanning close to 300 acres, the property functioned as a self-contained domain. It included formal gardens, fountains, greenhouses, farmland, a power plant, carriage houses, stables, staff housing, and service buildings spread across the estate. The main house was placed at the center of this system, both physically and symbolically. The structure that emerged over 3 years of construction was monumental. Built primarily of stone, Lynnewood Hall stretched horizontally in a long, commanding facade rather than vertically. This choice reinforced the idea of control over land rather than dominance through height. The building's footprint alone signaled power. With roughly 110 rooms, including 55 bedrooms and dozens of specialized spaces, the mansion approached 100,000 square feet when basements and attic levels were included. In comparison, the White House measured just over half that size. Yet, Lynnewood Hall was never intended to function like a government building. It was private, insulated, and meticulously organized around hierarchy. Every space served a purpose, and every purpose reinforced social order. Visitors entered through the Great Hall, a soaring interior space modeled in part after the breakers in Newport. The ceiling height, imported marble, and elaborate ironwork were calculated to overwhelm. This was not accidental excess. It was psychological architecture. Guests were meant to feel small, impressed, and aware of the power that resided within the walls. From there, movement through the house followed a carefully choreographed sequence. Reception rooms absorbed initial interactions. Ballrooms hosted formal gatherings. Art galleries elevated conversation and taste. At no point was the visitor allowed to forget where they were or whose world they had entered. Behind this visible spectacle existed an entirely separate operational universe. Service corridors, hidden staircases, tunnels, and mechanical systems allowed staff to move unseen. Kitchens were isolated for fire safety and efficiency. Food traveled through controlled routes. Communication systems connected rooms through call boxes, speaking tubes, and early signaling mechanisms. The house anticipated needs before they were expressed. Nothing was left to chance. The Widener household employed approximately 40 live-in servants at any given time. Their lives unfolded largely beneath the surface, in basements and attic wings, designed specifically to support the illusion of effortless luxury above. There were servant dining rooms, billiard rooms, bedrooms, workshops, and storage areas. Entire industries operated within the house itself. Upholstery, carpentry, baking, and repairs were handled in-house to maintain control and discretion. This was not simply a mansion. It was an ecosystem. But what truly distinguished Lynnewood Hall from other Gilded Age estates was its relationship to art. Peter Widener was not a casual collector. He viewed art as cultural capital, a form of legitimacy that money alone could not buy. His collection grew rapidly and ambitiously, encompassing Renaissance masters, Baroque portraiture, and rare antiquities. Unlike many contemporaries who used art purely as decoration, Widener structured his home around it. 5 rooms on the main floor were dedicated art galleries. Additional galleries occupied upper levels. Skylights were engineered to provide controlled natural illumination throughout the day. Panels, shutters, and mechanisms allowed light levels to be adjusted as the sun moved across the sky. Music was piped discreetly into galleries to shape atmosphere. The experience was immersive, deliberate, and highly curated. The house itself became secondary. This philosophy extended to the overall aesthetic. Compared to other Gilded Age mansions dripping with ornamentation, Lynnewood Hall was restrained. Elegant, yes. Luxurious, unquestionably. But the true spectacle was reserved for the artworks. Walls were designed to frame paintings. Ceilings were built to support imported frescoes. Floors were laid to guide movement through visual narratives. The Widener family lived inside a museum they privately owned. For a brief period, this world functioned exactly as intended. Lynnewood Hall hosted extravagant balls, masquerades, and formal events attended by elite society. Orchestras performed beneath vaulted ceilings. Guests wandered galleries lined with priceless works. Gardens glowed under lantern light. The estate embodied the Gilded Age fantasy of permanence through wealth. But beneath the surface, time was already working against it. The early 20th century brought seismic shifts. Economic volatility, changing social norms, and rising public scrutiny of extreme wealth began to erode the foundations of this lifestyle. The Widener family itself faced devastating personal losses, including the deaths of George Dunton Widener and his son Harry Elkins Widener aboard the RMS Titanic. These losses altered the trajectory of the estate. When Peter Widener died in 1915 at the age of 80, Lynnewood Hall passed to his son Joseph. Joseph Widener was fundamentally different from his father. Where Peter embraced Victorian heaviness, Joseph favored European refinement, particularly French aesthetics. One of his first major acts was to transform the house. Victorian interiors were stripped away, floors were replaced, ceilings were altered, fireplaces were moved or removed. French design elements replaced earlier ornamentation. The gardens were redesigned from Italianate forms into formal French parterres with fountains and terraces. Lynnewood Hall was not preserved. It was reimagined. Under Joseph's ownership, the art collection reached its peak. By the early 1920s, it was considered one of the finest private collections in the world. Yet, even as the house evolved, the era that had created it was ending. Industrial wealth fragmented across generations. Taxes increased. Labor costs rose. Public sentiment shifted. By the time Joseph Widener died in 1943, the Gilded Age was over. The art collection was donated to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., removing the very heart of the estate. Without the family, without the art, and without the social structure that sustained it, Lynnewood Hall no longer fit into modern American life. What remained was a massive, expensive, highly specialized structure built for a world that no longer existed. This was the beginning of its abandonment. The house would pass through institutional ownership, temporary stewardship, and eventual neglect. Portions would be maintained. Others would be altered. Some would be stripped. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Lynnewood Hall was too large, too expensive, and too culturally specific to survive unchanged. And yet, it did survive. Today, Lynnewood Hall stands as the largest abandoned mansion of America's Gilded Age. Its walls still hold the imprint of ambition. Its corridors still map social hierarchy. Its galleries still echo with the absence of art. It is not simply a ruin. It is a preserved moment, frozen between excess and collapse. To understand Lynnewood Hall is to understand the psychology of the Gilded Age itself, a belief that wealth could command time, that scale could guarantee legacy, that permanence could be built through stone, marble, and imported masterpieces. The house proves otherwise, and this is only the beginning of its story. As Lynnewood Hall moved into the second phase of its life, the mansion no longer functioned as a declaration of rising power, but as a test of whether such power could be maintained. The Gilded Age had produced estates on a scale never before attempted in the United States, yet it had failed to establish a sustainable model for their survival. Lynnewood Hall would become one of the clearest examples of this contradiction. By the time Joseph Widener fully assumed control of the estate after his father's death in 1915, America itself was changing rapidly. The First World War, shifting labor dynamics, and the early signals of progressive reform were beginning to place pressure on extreme concentrations of wealth. Yet within the walls of Lynnewood Hall, the world still operated according to an older logic. Joseph Widener's renovations were not merely aesthetic. They reflected a broader attempt to align the house with European aristocratic ideals rather than American industrial excess. Victorian interiors, which had emphasized density, ornament, and visual weight, were replaced with lighter French forms that prioritized symmetry, flow, and restraint. This transformation extended through nearly every major space. Floors that had once been solid white marble were replaced with patterned stone inspired by French chateaux. Moldings were simplified, ceilings were altered, fireplaces were relocated or removed entirely to accommodate new spatial priorities. Even the Great Hall, originally designed as a theatrical entrance, was softened to better match Joseph's vision. The house, in effect, was rewritten. This process erased many original features, but it also revealed the flexibility of the structure. Lynnewood Hall had been built with such massive scale and robust materials that it could absorb dramatic internal change without compromising its integrity. That durability would later become one of the reasons it survived long after other estates were demolished. The gardens underwent an equally significant transformation. Originally Italianate, with sunken parterres, balustrades, and classical ornamentation, they were reworked into a French tapis vert system. Long axial lawns extended outward from the house, punctuated by fountains and symmetrical plantings. These gardens were not meant for wandering. They were meant to be viewed, framed by windows and terraces, reinforcing the house's role as the central authority over the landscape. Everything pointed inward. Despite these refinements, Lynnewood Hall was already becoming an anomaly. By the 1920s, even among America's elite, estates of this scale were increasingly seen as impractical, The social world that had justified their construction was shrinking. Younger generations were less interested in maintaining vast households staffed by dozens of servants. Public scrutiny of wealth intensified. The cost of simply operating such a property grew exponentially. Yet, the Wideners persisted. Joseph Widener remained deeply committed to art collecting, and during this period, the galleries of Lynnewood Hall reached their zenith. Works by Rembrandt, Van Dyck, Bellini, Titian, Raphael, and countless others filled the walls. Entire rooms were devoted to specific artists or schools. The galleries were arranged not for spectacle alone, but for scholarly engagement. Visitors did not simply view art. They were guided through a narrative. Lighting was carefully controlled through skylights and adjustable panels. Music was subtly integrated through hidden speakers embedded in walls and arches. The galleries were designed to engage the senses without overwhelming them. This approach was highly advanced for its time, predating modern museum design philosophies by decades. But while the interior experience was refined, the financial reality was increasingly untenable. Maintaining Lynnewood Hall required enormous resources. Heating alone demanded a dedicated power plant. Coal-fired systems generated steam that traveled underground from across the road to heat the house safely. Repairs were constant. Staff wages, food, maintenance, and security created an unending stream of expense. Even for a family of the Wideners' wealth, the cost was immense. The house consumed wealth as efficiently as it displayed it. By the time Joseph Widener died in 1943, the logic that had sustained Lynnewood Hall was gone. The Second World War marked a definitive end to the Gilded Age mentality. Industrial fortunes were fragmented by inheritance. Tax structures penalized excess property. Labor shortages made large domestic staffs unrealistic. Public opinion no longer tolerated visible excess. The Widener family made a decision that would permanently alter the estate's fate. The art collection was donated to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This act ensured the preservation of the works, but it stripped Lynnewood Hall of its core purpose. The galleries were emptied. The walls that had been designed around masterpieces were suddenly bare. What remained was architecture without content, a museum without art, without the family, and without the collection. Lynnewood Hall could no longer function as a private residence. No individual buyer could reasonably maintain it. No single family required such a space. The estate entered a new phase defined not by ambition, but by adaptation. In 1952, Lynnewood Hall was purchased by a theological seminary. This marked a profound shift in the building's identity. Where once it had served as a fortress of wealth, it now became an institutional campus. Bedrooms were converted into dormitories. Galleries became classrooms. Kitchens were simplified. Spaces designed for spectacle were repurposed for utility. For several decades, the seminary maintained the property with care. Roofs were repaired. Grounds were kept. The building remained structurally sound. Yet institutional use brought compromises. Some historic elements were removed. Others were altered beyond recognition. As financial pressures mounted in the late 20th century, portions of the house were stripped and sold to cover operating costs. Fireplaces, fixtures, moldings, and decorative elements quietly left the building. This process was not malicious. It was survival. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the seminary itself faced insolvency. Lynnewood Hall, once again, was too large, too costly, and too specialized to sustain its occupants. When the seminary vacated the property in the mid-1990s, the estate entered its most vulnerable period. Ownership transferred into private hands. For a brief time, there was hope for restoration. Plans were discussed. Assessments were made. But the scale of the challenge became immediately apparent. Restoring Lynnewood Hall to any version of its former state would require hundreds of millions of dollars, specialized craftsmanship, and decades of work. The house slipped into limbo. Without consistent maintenance, decay began to accelerate. Roof leaks allowed water to infiltrate ceilings and walls. Ironwork rusted. Plaster cracked and fell. Skylights were sealed to prevent further damage, plunging galleries into darkness. Marble surfaces dulled under neglect. Entire rooms sat frozen, partially intact, partially collapsing. Yet even in decay, Lynnewood Hall refused to disappear. Its bones were too strong, its materials too substantial. Stone walls held firm. Vault doors remained sealed. Tunnels continued to run beneath the gardens. Swimming pools, spa rooms, and service corridors endured beneath layers of dust and debris. The scale that had once made the house impractical now protected it from total loss. The mansion became a time capsule. Walking through Lynnewood Hall today is not like visiting a typical ruin. It is not overgrown or erased. It is suspended. Furniture outlines remain visible on floors. Wall discoloration marks where paintings once hung. Light filters through broken windows onto surfaces that were last touched by another era. Every space tells two stories simultaneously, one of extraordinary creation and one of gradual abandonment. This duality is what makes Lynnewood Hall unique among Gilded Age estates. Many were demolished. Others were heavily modernized. Few were left intact enough to preserve their original logic. Lynnewood Hall still reveals how wealth organized space, controlled movement, and constructed hierarchy. It also reveals the limits of that control. Preservation efforts today face immense challenges. Stabilization alone requires vast resources. Restoration would demand not only money, but historical precision, skilled labor, and long-term stewardship. There is no clear financial incentive. There is no obvious modern use that aligns with the building's scale. And yet, the argument for preservation persists. Lynnewood Hall is more than a mansion. It is an architectural document. It records how America's wealthiest citizens once imagined permanence. It shows how cultural capital was curated, displayed, and controlled. It exposes the infrastructure required to sustain luxury at its highest level. Most importantly, it forces a confrontation with impermanence. The Gilded Age believed that wealth could outlast time. That stone could preserve legacy. That scale could defeat decline. Lynnewood Hall stands as evidence to the contrary. Its survival is not proof of success, but of endurance. It remains, not because it fulfilled its promise, but because it was too massive to erase easily. And as long as it stands, it continues to speak. In its silence, it tells the story of ambition without sustainability, of beauty without continuity, of power that could build a palace but could not ensure its future. This is the second act of Lynnewood Hall, and the final chapters are still being written. By the time Lynnewood Hall entered the 21st century, it no longer belonged to any clear category. It was not a functioning estate, not a restored landmark, and not yet a ruin reduced to memory. Instead, it existed in a rare and uneasy state between preservation and collapse, carrying the full psychological weight of the Gilded Age into the modern era. What makes Lynnewood Hall exceptional is not simply its size or its abandonment, but the completeness of what remains. Unlike many great mansions that were subdivided, modernized, or demolished, this structure still preserves the original logic of how extreme wealth once organized life. Every corridor, gallery, vault, and service tunnel still communicates intent. To walk through Lynnewood Hall today is to walk through a system designed for control. Movement through the house was never random. Public spaces were meant to be encountered first, rising in intensity as one progressed inward. The Great Hall established dominance. The reception rooms filtered access. The ballrooms and galleries elevated status. Private bedrooms were carefully segregated by wing, hierarchy, and generation. Servants were routed through entirely separate vertical and horizontal systems, ensuring that luxury appeared effortless. This design philosophy reflected the Gilded Age belief that wealth functioned best when invisible labor supported visible grandeur. The tunnels beneath Lynnewood Hall remain among its most striking features. Running under the gardens and extending toward fountains and service areas, they allowed water, heat, and personnel to move unseen. These passages were not decorative curiosities, they were essential infrastructure. Steam traveled from the coal-fired power plant across the road through underground channels. Water systems fed fountains and baths. Supplies moved without interrupting the household above. In modern terms, Lynnewood Hall operated like a private city. The basement alone housed an astonishing range of functions. There were main kitchens, bakeries for bread and pastry, cold storage rooms, ice cream rooms, coal storage areas, trash rooms, pantries, carpentry and upholstery shops, staff dining rooms, lounges, vaults, and mechanical rooms. Large events required industrial-level preparation, and the house was built to support them without strain. This infrastructure explains why Lynnewood Hall was able to host gatherings on a scale that bordered on myth. Masked balls, costume parties, and formal entertainments brought hundreds of guests into the house. Orchestras performed from galleries above. Food moved invisibly. Lighting was carefully controlled. The experience was seamless, theatrical, and overwhelming. But this seamlessness depended entirely on constant maintenance. Once the system began to break down, decay accelerated. Water intrusion is particularly destructive in buildings of this size. When roofs fail, moisture spreads rapidly through ceilings, walls, and floors. Plaster softens, iron corrodes, wood swells and fractures. In Lynnewood Hall, sealed skylights darkened galleries designed to depend on natural light. Broken windows allowed temperature extremes to infiltrate interiors built for controlled environments. The house was not designed to be dormant. Every year without active use compounds damage. Even marble, often thought indestructible, suffers under neglect. Staining, cracking, and spalling appear. Decorative stone loses definition. Carvings erode. Paint flakes away, revealing layers of previous eras beneath. And yet, the craftsmanship still speaks. Hand-carved moldings remain sharp in many rooms. Ceiling medallions survive where moisture has not reached them. Imported fireplaces, some taken from Italian palaces and villas, still anchor spaces with weight and dignity. Vault doors, some made of railroad steel, remain sealed and formidable. These elements remind us that Lynnewood Hall was built to endure longer than most human lives. The upper floors reveal a more intimate side of the estate. Bedrooms were not uniform. Each suite reflected the personality and status of its occupant. Peter Widener's rooms favored restraint and function. Joseph Widener's spaces reflected French influence and masculine solidity. Eleanor Elkins. Widener's suite was elaborate, filled with marble, vaults for jewelry, and carefully curated decoration. These were not simply sleeping quarters, they were expressions of identity. Children's rooms, tutors' rooms, and governess suites reveal the household's emphasis on education and control. French tutors were employed to ensure cultural refinement. Languages were enforced. Etiquette was taught alongside academics. The house functioned as both a home and a finishing school for elite society. Servants' quarters, by contrast, were deliberately simple. Small rooms, narrow corridors, minimal ornamentation. Yet even here, attention to detail remained. Stair railings featured decorative ironwork. Doors mirrored patterns used elsewhere in the house. This was not neglect. It was hierarchy made physical. The swimming pool and spa complex further illustrate the Widener approach to luxury. Private indoor pools were rare, even among the wealthy at the turn of the century. Lynnewood Hall's pool was deep, marble-lined, and surrounded by mirrors and changing rooms. Adjacent spa spaces included showers, massage areas, and possibly saunas. Heating systems and boilers supported this complex, reinforcing the idea that the house existed to provide total comfort within its walls. Few private residences anywhere in the world rivaled this level of self-sufficiency. And yet, self-sufficiency did not equal sustainability. The economic structures that supported Lynnewood Hall collapsed gradually but decisively. Inheritance diluted fortunes. Taxation penalized land and excess property. Social expectations shifted away from domestic grandeur toward mobility and discretion. By the mid-20th century, houses like Lynnewood Hall had become liabilities. This is why so many were destroyed. In cities like New York, Fifth Avenue palaces were demolished one by one. Estates across the country were subdivided, sold, or razed. Lynnewood Hall survived largely because of its location, institutional reuse, and sheer difficulty to demolish. Its stone walls and massive scale made destruction expensive and impractical. Survival, in this case, was accidental. Today, preservation advocates face a dilemma. Restoring Lynnewood Hall would require a vision that respects its historical integrity while acknowledging modern realities. There is no simple adaptive reuse that aligns with its design. Converting it into housing would compromise its structure. Turning it into a museum would require operational funding on an enormous scale. Leaving it untouched ensures continued decay. Yet abandoning it entirely would mean losing one of the most complete physical records of the American Gilded Age. Lynnewood Hall offers something rare. It allows us to study how wealth once structured daily life at its most extreme. It shows how architecture was used to reinforce power, hierarchy, and identity. It reveals the hidden labor systems that sustained visible luxury. And it demonstrates how fragile such systems become once their economic and cultural foundations erode. The mansion is often described as red, not only because of the brick and stone tones that dominate its exterior in certain light, but because of what it represents. It is a red flag from history, a warning embedded in architecture. It asks a fundamental question. What happens when ambition outruns continuity? The Widener family built Lynnewood Hall to last forever. They invested vast sums, imported materials from across the world, and engineered systems that rivaled small cities. They believed they were constructing a permanent legacy. Instead, they created a structure that outlived its purpose. That paradox is its greatest value. In its abandoned state, Lynnewood Hall speaks more clearly than it ever did in its prime. Without art on the walls, without guests filling the halls, without staff moving silently through corridors, the architecture stands exposed. Its logic is laid bare. Its assumptions are visible. Its limitations are undeniable. This is why Lynnewood Hall matters. It is not simply a story of loss. It is a story of transition. From private wealth to public memory, from dominance to documentation, from ownership to stewardship. Whether it is ultimately restored or continues to decay, Lynnewood Hall has already achieved a different kind of permanence. It has become a reference point, a case study, a physical narrative of how the Gilded Age rose, flourished, and collapsed under its own weight. The house still stands, not because the Gilded Age succeeded, but because it failed slowly enough to leave evidence behind. And that evidence, written in stone and silence, continues to challenge how we think about wealth, legacy, and time. This is not the end of Lynnewood Hall. It is the echo of its truth. As the story of Lynnewood Hall continues, the mansion moves beyond architecture and into symbolism. What remains today is not simply a decaying structure, but a physical record of how America once imagined success, permanence, and power. In many ways, Lynnewood Hall represents the final, fully realized form of the Gilded Age mindset before it collapsed under modern reality. The Gilded Age was built on acceleration. Wealth was made quickly, often within a single lifetime. Industries expanded faster than laws could regulate them. Cities grew upward and outward at unprecedented speed. Fortunes appeared so vast that their owners believed they were immune to time itself. Houses like Lynnewood Hall were the logical outcome of that belief. They were meant to freeze success in stone. Yet architecture, no matter how grand, cannot escape economics. Once the social ecosystem that justified Lynnewood Hall disappeared, the mansion was left without a role. It was too large to be a home, too private to be a public building without radical alteration, and too expensive to be maintained for nostalgia alone. This is where the tension between preservation and decay becomes most visible. Walking through Lynnewood Hall today reveals a strange contradiction. On one hand, there is unmistakable deterioration. Ceilings sag, floors buckle, paint peels in sheets, water stains spread across plaster like slow-moving shadows. On the other hand, there is astonishing resilience. Structural walls remain solid, staircases hold, vaults remain sealed, marble fixtures still dominate rooms long abandoned. This contrast reinforces a key truth about the Gilded Age. The materials were built to last. The ideology was not. The Widener family believed that scale itself created meaning. Bigger houses meant greater importance. Longer galleries meant deeper culture. More servants meant higher status. But what Lynnewood Hall ultimately proves is that scale without adaptability becomes a burden. The very features that made the house extraordinary also made it unusable in later generations. Consider the service systems. 40 to 50 live-in servants were once essential to daily operations. Today, that number alone makes private use impossible. Heating systems designed for constant operation fail when left dormant. Skylights engineered for controlled daylight become liabilities when maintenance stops. Tunnels meant to conceal labor become pathways for moisture and decay. The house was designed for a world that no longer exists. This is why Lynnewood Hall occupies such a unique place in American architectural history. It was never subdivided into apartments. It was never gutted into a modern shell. It was never flattened into absence. Instead, it lingered, partially used, partially neglected, suspended between relevance and ruin. That suspension gives it power. Unlike restored mansions that present a polished version of history, Lynnewood Hall shows the full arc: creation, peak, decline, uncertainty. It allows us to see not only what the Gilded Age aspired to be, but what it became when the money, people, and social structures disappeared. There is also something deeply human embedded in its abandonment. The Widener family did not fail in the way popular mythology often suggests. They did not lose everything overnight. They did not vanish into obscurity. Instead, their wealth diffused. It transformed into institutions, philanthropy, and cultural legacy. Harvard's Widener Library stands as a living monument to one branch of the family's values. The National Gallery of Art houses masterpieces once displayed at Lynnewood Hall. The legacy survived. The house did not. This separation is crucial. It reveals that legacy does not require physical permanence. In fact, the attempt to enforce permanence through architecture often accelerates collapse. Lynnewood Hall became too heavy to carry forward, even as the family's influence continued elsewhere. In that sense, the mansion is not a failure. It is evidence of transition. Modern preservation efforts reflect this understanding. Rather than attempting to recreate a fantasy version of the past, advocates now focus on stabilization, documentation, and long-term planning. The goal is no longer to return Lynnewood Hall to its peak, but to ensure it does not vanish entirely. Restoration on this scale would be unprecedented. It would require not only funding, but philosophical clarity. What should Lynnewood Hall become? A museum? A cultural center? An educational institution? A hybrid public space? Each option carries trade-offs that would alter the building's identity. And yet, doing nothing is also a choice. Left alone, Lynnewood Hall will continue to decay. Nature will reclaim interiors. Structural failures will multiply. Eventually, safety concerns will force irreversible decisions. The window for thoughtful intervention is limited. This urgency is part of what gives the mansion its emotional weight. Lynnewood Hall is often described as haunting, but not because of ghosts. It is haunting because it reveals how quickly certainty dissolves. At its peak, this house represented confidence so absolute that it bordered on arrogance. Today, it stands vulnerable, dependent on volunteers, advocates, and uncertain futures. That reversal is profound. The mansion also challenges modern assumptions about wealth. In an era where fortunes are increasingly digital, mobile, and abstract, Lynnewood Hall reminds us of a time when wealth demanded physical manifestation. Money had to be seen, touched, and walked through. It had to occupy land, command labor, and reshape landscapes. That model no longer functions. Modern wealth avoids immobility. It avoids permanence. It avoids responsibility for maintenance on this scale. In that sense, Lynnewood Hall marks the end of an era not just architecturally, but psychologically. It represents the last moment when Americans believed that building bigger was the same as building forever. Standing inside the galleries today, stripped of art, that belief collapses completely. Empty walls speak louder than filled ones ever could. They show how dependent meaning was on constant reinforcement. Without paintings, music, light, and people, the rooms become shells. Beautiful shells, but shells nonetheless. This is why documentation matters. Every photograph, every walkthrough, every recorded detail becomes a form of preservation. Even if the structure itself cannot be fully saved, its story can be. Lynnewood Hall offers lessons that extend far beyond architecture. It teaches about economic cycles, cultural ambition, inheritance, and the limits of control. It teaches humility. No matter how vast the resources, no matter how skilled the craftsman, no matter how deliberate the design, nothing escapes time. The Gilded Age tried to outrun it. Lynnewood Hall shows the result. And yet, there is also hope embedded in its walls. Preservation is not only about freezing the past. It is about creating continuity of understanding. Lynnewood Hall can still serve as a site of education, reflection, and dialogue. It can remind future generations that wealth carries responsibility, that ambition requires foresight, and that legacy is not guaranteed by size alone. The mansion no longer needs to impress. Its value now lies in honesty. Honesty about excess. Honesty about fragility. Honesty about impermanence. As long as Lynnewood Hall stands, even in partial ruin, it continues to tell a story no modern structure can replicate. A story written not in words, but in scale, silence, and space. This is the final transformation of Lynnewood Hall. From palace to institution to abandonment to artifact. Not a monument to wealth, but a monument to the consequences of believing wealth could last forever. As Lynnewood Hall moves deeper into the present, its meaning continues to evolve. What was once a private world built for a single family has become a shared question mark for historians, preservationists, and the public. The mansion no longer exists for those who built it, nor even for those who briefly maintained it afterward. It exists now as a responsibility, one that no single generation originally planned for, yet one that cannot be ignored. The most striking aspect of Lynnewood Hall today is how complete its narrative still feels. Even stripped of art, furniture, and people, the house remains legible. You can still understand how it worked. You can still trace the daily rhythms that once governed life inside its walls. Morning routines beginning in private bedrooms, servants moving quietly through secondary staircases, meals prepared far below ground and delivered without spectacle, guests arriving, ascending, and being gradually immersed into spaces designed to impress and dominate. That clarity is rare. Most abandoned estates lose their logic quickly. Walls are removed, rooms are altered, systems are dismantled. Lynnewood Hall avoided that fate largely because its scale made alteration difficult. It was easier to leave it intact than to meaningfully change it. As a result, the house now serves as a three-dimensional archive of elite American life at its peak. This is where its greatest value lies. Lynnewood Hall shows how architecture functioned as social engineering. The separation of public and private was absolute. The segregation of labor was total. Even sound was controlled. Music traveled through hidden speakers. Voices were absorbed by heavy materials. Silence itself became a luxury. Every design choice reinforced the idea that wealth could orchestrate experience. But that orchestration required constant input. The Gilded Age often appears in hindsight as effortless elegance, yet Lynnewood Hall exposes how artificial that appearance truly was. Nothing functioned without labor. Nothing remained clean, warm, or illuminated without continuous human effort. The moment that effort stopped, decay began. This is not unique to Lynnewood Hall. It is a universal truth of extreme wealth. Large estates do not simply age, they unravel. Maintenance. Delays turn into structural failures. Deferred repairs multiply. Systems designed to operate daily fail when idle. This is why abandonment is so destructive. Buildings like Lynnewood Hall were never meant to rest. Time inside the mansion feels uneven. Some rooms appear almost untouched, as if the occupants stepped away briefly and never returned. Others are deeply scarred, with collapsed ceilings and exposed framing. This unevenness reflects the reality of partial care over decades. Some areas were protected, others were sacrificed. Even this tells a story. It reveals which spaces were valued longest and which were allowed to disappear first. Public rooms often fared better, maintained for appearances during institutional use. Private spaces suffered more. Servants' areas, always secondary, deteriorated fastest. Hierarchy persisted even in abandonment. One of the most haunting elements of Lynnewood Hall is its silence. In its prime, the house was full of sound. Music from orchestras, conversations echoing through halls, footsteps of staff moving constantly, machinery operating below ground, water flowing through fountains, steam traveling through pipes. Today, that soundscape is gone. What remains is an acoustic void broken only by wind, dripping water, or shifting debris. The absence amplifies scale. Rooms feel larger, colder, more exposed. Silence becomes oppressive rather than refined. It transforms luxury into vulnerability. This shift is emotional as much as architectural. Lynnewood Hall forces confrontation with impermanence in a way few structures do. It was built by people who believed deeply in progress, control, and continuity. They believed that wealth, properly organized, could transcend time. The house disproves that belief not through sudden collapse, but through slow erosion. There is something profoundly instructive about that pace. The mansion did not fail dramatically. It faded. Generation by generation, use narrowed. Purpose weakened. Maintenance slowed. Eventually, abandonment occurred not because of catastrophe, but because continuation no longer made sense. That is the quiet ending of many great systems. Preservation debates surrounding Lynnewood Hall often struggle with this reality. Should it be restored to a specific moment in time? If so, which one? The Victorian original? Joseph Widener's French Transformation? The Seminary era? Each represents a different philosophy, a different identity imposed on the same structure. Choosing one means erasing others. There is also the question of honesty. Restoring Lynnewood Hall to a polished state risks turning it into a fantasy version of the past, disconnected from the economic and social forces that led to its abandonment. Leaving it entirely untouched risks irreversible loss. Between these extremes lies documentation. In many ways, Lynnewood Hall's most important preservation may already be happening through recording, research, and public awareness. Every measured drawing, photograph, and walkthrough captures details that might otherwise vanish. Every retelling of its history reinforces its relevance beyond aesthetics. The mansion no longer needs to function to matter. It matters because it reveals how wealth behaves over time. It shows that accumulation is easier than stewardship, that building is easier than maintaining, that ambition often outpaces planning for decline. These lessons resonate far beyond the Gilded Age. Modern societies continue to build at scale, often without clear plans for long-term use. Infrastructure ages, institutions evolve. What once seemed permanent becomes obsolete. Lynnewood Hall offers a cautionary parallel. It asks whether we are repeating the same assumptions under different conditions. The Widener family did not imagine abandonment. They imagined continuity through inheritance. What they underestimated was how quickly cultural values change. Future generations did not want to live the same way. They did not want the same responsibilities. The house, optimized for a specific lifestyle, could not adapt. Flexibility is the true measure of longevity. Lynnewood Hall had strength, beauty, and precision. What it lacked was adaptability. Its scale resisted transformation. Its systems required constant upkeep. Its meaning was tied too tightly to a vanished social world. And yet, this rigidity is precisely what makes it invaluable today. Because it did not adapt, it preserved its original form. Because it was too large to easily repurpose, it avoided modernization. Because it lingered in uncertainty, it remained intact enough to study. The mansion became a fossil. Fossils do not function. They teach. Lynnewood Hall teaches about aspiration, excess, craftsmanship, and the cost of believing that wealth alone can guarantee permanence. It teaches that buildings outlive people, but not intentions. That legacy is fragile. That memory requires care. Standing on the grounds today, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what once was. The long facade still commands attention. The symmetry still impresses. The gardens, even altered, still suggest former grandeur. Yet the emptiness changes the experience entirely. The house no longer asserts dominance. It asks questions. Who is responsible for preserving the past? What deserves to be saved, and why? How much should society invest in remembering elite history? What lessons do these spaces offer beyond nostalgia? There are no easy answers, but Lynnewood Hall makes avoidance impossible. Its presence demands engagement. It refuses to quietly disappear. It stands as a reminder that even the most confident eras leave behind unresolved consequences. In the end, Lynnewood Hall may never return to what it was. It may never host art-filled galleries, orchestras, or grand balls again. That loss is real. But what it has become may be equally important. It is a place where history is not curated, but exposed. Where ambition is visible in stone. Where decay is not hidden, but instructive. The largest abandoned mansion of America's Gilded Age no longer celebrates wealth, it interrogates it. And as long as its walls remain standing, that interrogation continues. As Lynnewood Hall enters the final stretch of its existence as a living structure rather than a memory, its story becomes less about what was built and more about what was revealed. The mansion no longer performs, it no longer hosts, it no longer displays wealth as spectacle. Instead, it exposes the mechanics behind that spectacle with a clarity that would have been impossible during its peak. What remains inside Lynnewood Hall today is not luxury, but evidence. Every architectural decision reveals a priority. Every corridor reveals a hierarchy. Every abandoned system reveals dependence. The house, stripped of its intended illusion, becomes brutally honest. And in that honesty, it tells us far more about the Gilded Age than it ever did when it was alive. At its core, Lynnewood Hall was built on a single assumption: that wealth, once accumulated, could be stabilized through scale. Bigger houses meant stronger legacies. More land meant more permanence. More art meant cultural immunity. This assumption guided not only the design of the mansion, but the worldview of those who commissioned it. The Gilded Age elite believed they were creating dynasties. But dynasties require continuity, not just capital. They require systems that adapt, values that transfer, and structures that can evolve without collapsing. Lynnewood Hall demonstrates what happens when those elements are missing. The Widener fortune did not vanish. It transformed. It dispersed into institutions, philanthropy, and cultural memory. What failed was the physical container built to hold that fortune in one place. The mansion demanded too much from each successive generation: too much maintenance, too much responsibility, too much emotional attachment to a way of life that no longer made sense. In this way, Lynnewood Hall did not fall victim to poverty. It fell victim to excess. Excess is often misunderstood as indulgence, but in architecture, excess is rigidity. When a structure is optimized too narrowly for a specific lifestyle, it loses the ability to evolve. Lynnewood Hall was optimized for late 19th century elite domestic life. Once that life disappeared, the house had nowhere to go. This is why adaptive reuse proved so difficult. Modern buildings are often designed with modularity. Spaces can be repurposed. Systems can be updated. Lynnewood Hall resisted this by design. Its rooms were specialized. Its circulation paths were hierarchical. Its infrastructure was embedded deeply into the fabric of the building. Altering one part risked destabilizing the whole. Even institutional use struggled against these constraints. When the seminary occupied the estate, it did so by compromise. Bedrooms became dormitories. Galleries became classrooms. But these were surface-level adaptations. The deeper logic of the building remained unchanged. The house still demanded attention, still consumed resources, still resisted simplification. Eventually, even compromise became unsustainable. What we see now is the outcome of that tension. A structure too important to destroy easily, too impractical to use fully, and too valuable to ignore. Lynnewood Hall exists in a liminal state, defined not by function, but by meaning. Meaning shifts with perspective. To preservationists, Lynnewood Hall is an irreplaceable artifact, a complete example of Gilded Age planning, infrastructure, and social philosophy. To developers, it is an unsolvable equation, a property whose restoration costs far exceed any realistic return. To historians, it is a case study. To the public, it is a symbol, a haunting reminder of excess, ambition, and decline. All of these interpretations coexist. This multiplicity is part of why Lynnewood Hall matters so deeply. It refuses to be reduced to a single narrative. It is not simply a tragedy, nor simply a cautionary tale, nor simply a marvel. It is all of these at once. The longer it stands abandoned, the more its role shifts from residence to record. Consider the art galleries. once meticulously curated, now empty. Their proportions still guide the eye. Their skylights still mark where light once fell. Their walls still bear discoloration from paintings that hung for decades. The absence becomes a presence. Viewers are forced to imagine what once was, and in doing so, confront the fragility of cultural ownership. Art survived by leaving the house. The Widener collection found permanence not through private control, but through public stewardship. This is one of the most telling lessons of Lynnewood Hall. What endured was not the mansion, but the decision to share. The act of donation preserved the art. The act of hoarding could not preserve the house. Legacy followed openness, not enclosure. The same can be said of memory. Lynnewood Hall remained private for much of its decline. Its deterioration happened quietly. Only recently has public awareness grown through documentation, exploration, and historical research. That exposure has transformed the mansion's role. It is no longer just an abandoned estate, it is a subject of collective concern. Concern, however, does not guarantee rescue. There is a hard truth embedded in the preservation debate. Not every structure can be saved. Resources are finite. Attention shifts. Priorities compete. Saving Lynnewood Hall would require a commitment that extends beyond sentiment. It would demand long-term funding, governance, and purpose. Purpose is the hardest question. What should Lynnewood Hall become if it is to survive? A museum risks freezing it into spectacle. A private residence contradicts its scale. An institutional campus repeats a failed model. A mixed-use public space would require intrusive alterations. Every option risks erasing something essential. This uncertainty is not failure, it is honesty. The Gilded Age avoided such questions by assuming permanence. Modern society does not have that luxury. We must decide what to carry forward and why. Lynnewood Hall forces that decision into the open. Even if restoration never happens, its value does not disappear. Ruins have always played a role in historical understanding. They show what civilizations valued, how they organized themselves, and where they miscalculated. Lynnewood Hall functions as a modern ruin, but with an unusual degree of preservation. It allows us to study a recent past with forensic detail. We can see how servants lived relative to owners, how privacy was engineered, how technology was integrated into domestic life, how art shaped architecture, how wealth demanded separation rather than connection. These insights are rare. Most Gilded Age mansions that survive today do so as curated environments. Their decay has been erased. Their narratives are controlled. Lynnewood Hall offers something different. It shows the consequences of neglect without romanticizing it. It reveals damage alongside beauty. It allows contradiction. In that sense, it is more truthful than restoration. Truth is uncomfortable. It shows that grandeur was dependent on exploitation, labor, and constant input. It shows that cultural authority was purchased and displayed. It shows that the illusion of permanence required extraordinary effort to maintain. And it shows that when effort stopped, collapse began immediately. There is no villain in this story. No single decision doomed Lynnewood Hall. It was undone by time, change, and human limitation. The house asked too much of the future, and the future declined. This may be the most important lesson Lynnewood Hall offers. Legacy cannot be imposed. It must be adaptable. It must invite participation rather than demand maintenance. It must evolve with those who inherit it. The Widener family created extraordinary things. They built institutions that still function. They donated art that still inspires. They shaped cultural landscapes beyond their own lives. What failed was the assumption that a physical structure could carry all of that weight alone. Lynnewood Hall was asked to do too much. As it stands now, quiet and exposed, the mansion no longer pretends otherwise. It does not promise immortality. It does not assert dominance. It simply exists, waiting for interpretation. That waiting is powerful. It gives us time to reflect, to question our own assumptions about wealth, architecture, and memory, to consider what we are building today and whether it will make sense tomorrow. Lynnewood Hall does not demand admiration anymore. It demands thought. And perhaps that is its final, unintended achievement. In losing its original purpose, it gained a new one, not as a palace, not as a museum, not as a home, but as a lesson written in stone, silence, and scale. A lesson America is still learning